Elijah Carter had always been cautious when walking home late at night. Growing up in a neighborhood where racial profiling was common, he knew that even the slightest misstep could land him in trouble. But that night, as he walked down the dimly lit street, he had no idea that he was about to experience the most terrifying moment of his life. He had just finished a long shift at the community center, where he mentored young kids. Exhausted but satisfied, he hummed a tune under his breath, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Suddenly, the blinding glare of flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street. A police cruiser pulled up beside him, and before he could react, two white officers stepped out, hands resting on their holsters. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" one of them barked. Elijah froze, his heart pounding. He knew better than to run. Raising his hands slowly, he turned to face them. "What's the problem, officers?" he asked calmly. "We got a report about a suspicious individual matching your description," the second officer sneered. "Mind telling us what you're doing out here this late?" Elijah clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "I just got off work. I live 3 blocks from here." "That so?" The first officer stepped closer, looking him up and down. "You got ID?" Elijah nodded and slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. But before he could hand it over, one officer grabbed his arm roughly. "What's in the bag?" the other officer demanded, yanking it off his shoulder. Elijah barely had time to protest before he was slammed against the squad car. "You're resisting arrest," one of them muttered, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Elijah knew he was in trouble. Elijah struggled against the firm grip of the officers, his face pressed against the cold hood of the police car. He wasn't resisting, but the officers acted as if he were a threat. "Please," he said through gritted teeth, "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer holding him down chuckled. "That's what they all say." The second officer rummaged through Elijah's backpack, tossing his notebook, water bottle, and a neatly packed lunch onto the pavement. He held up Elijah's ID and examined it under the dim streetlight. "Says here you live 3 blocks away," the officer scoffed. "What's a guy like you doing walking around at this hour?" Elijah took a deep breath. "I told you, I just got off work. I mentor kids at the community center." The officer holding his ID smirked. "Yeah, and I'm the mayor." Elijah winced as the first officer tightened the cuffs around his wrists. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. The street was empty, no witnesses in sight. Then, the situation took a turn for the worse. The officer with the cuffs nodded to his partner. "Let's teach him a lesson." Elijah's stomach twisted in fear as they dragged him toward a nearby electric pole. One officer pulled a thick zip tie from his belt, while the other forced Elijah to his knees. "Please," Elijah pleaded, his voice cracking. "This isn't right." The officer ignored him, looping the zip tie around Elijah's wrists and fastening it tightly to the pole. "You like walking these streets at night?" one officer taunted. "Let's see how you like standing still." Elijah's heart pounded as he realized no one was coming to help him. Elijah's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he tested the tightness of the zip tie binding his wrists to the electric pole. The sharp plastic bit into his skin, cutting off circulation. The 2 officers stood a few feet away, laughing as if they had just played a harmless prank. "Bet you won't be so quick to walk these streets at night again," one of them sneered. Elijah's eyes darted up and down the empty road. No cars. No people. Just the dim glow of a flickering streetlight overhead. His only hope was that someone, anyone, would happen to walk by and intervene. "Come on, man," Elijah tried one last time. "This isn't right. You're supposed to protect and serve." The second officer leaned in close, his breath reeking of coffee and arrogance. "We protect who we want, and right now, you're nobody." With that, they turned and walked back to their patrol car. The engine roared to life, and in seconds the vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving Elijah alone and restrained. Panic surged through his body. His arms ached from the awkward position. He shifted his weight from one foot to another, trying to maintain balance. He had no way to reach his phone, which was still in his backpack, now scattered across the ground. The night air grew colder. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Would someone see him? Would someone help? Or would he be left here until the morning, humiliated and in pain? A rustling sound caught his attention. Footsteps approached from the distance. Elijah's heart pounded. Who was coming? A savior, or someone even worse? Elijah strained his neck, trying to see who was approaching. His heart pounded as the footsteps grew louder. Was it another cop? A stranger? Someone who would make things worse? A silhouette emerged under the dim streetlight. It was an older black man, wearing a faded jacket and a worn-out cap. He carried a small bag of groceries and walked with a slight limp. As soon as his eyes landed on Elijah, his pace slowed. "What the hell?" the man muttered, looking around as if expecting to see someone else nearby. He stepped closer, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "Son, what happened to you?" Elijah exhaled sharply. "Two cops. They tied me here and left." The man's jaw clenched. "Figures." He set his groceries down and pulled a small pocket knife from his coat. "Let's get you out of this." Elijah's wrists burned as the man sawed at the zip tie. Each movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his arms. Finally, with a sharp snap, the plastic restraint broke, and Elijah's hands were free. He staggered forward, catching himself against the pole. "Easy now," the man said, steadying him. "You all right?" Elijah flexed his fingers, trying to shake off the numbness. "I think so." The man glanced down the empty street. "These cops, you get their names?" Elijah shook his head. "No, but I won't forget their faces." The older man nodded. "Good, you need to report this." Elijah looked at him, skepticism in his eyes. "Who's going to believe me?" A knowing look crossed the man's face. "Trust me, son, you ain't alone in this." Elijah took a deep breath. Maybe, just maybe, he still had a fighting chance. Elijah rubbed his sore wrists, his mind racing. The older man, who introduced himself as Harold, watched him closely. "You need to go to the station and file a complaint," Harold said firmly. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. "Against the same cops who did this to me? That's like walking into a lion's den." Harold crossed his arms. "Son, I've been around long enough to know that silence don't change nothing. You let them get away with this, they'll do it to someone else." Elijah sighed, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. He had seen stories of people fighting back only to be ignored, or worse, but something about Harold's confidence made him hesitate. "What if they come after me?" Elijah asked. Harold smirked. "They already did. But you got something now. You got a story. And stories, they got power." Elijah thought for a moment before nodding. "All right, I'll do it." Harold clapped him on the shoulder. "Good, but you ain't going alone." Before Elijah could ask what he meant, Harold pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's me. We got a problem. Meet us at the station." 15 minutes later, Elijah and Harold arrived at the police station. Outside, a small group of people waited. Harold's friends, community activists, and even a local journalist. Elijah's nerves rattled, but Harold nudged him forward. "We walk in together, loud and proud." As they stepped through the doors, Elijah realized something. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. Elijah's heart pounded as he stepped into the police station, flanked by Harold and the small group of supporters. The air inside was thick with tension. Officers at the front desk glanced up, their expressions shifting from boredom to suspicion. A tall officer with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with authority. Elijah swallowed hard, but Harold stepped in before he could speak. "We're here to file a formal complaint." The officer raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Elijah squared his shoulders. "Two officers harassed me, tied me to an electric pole, and left me there." A beat of silence followed. Then the officer scoffed. "That's a serious accusation." Elijah nodded, because it really happened. The officer's gaze flickered to Harold, then to the people behind them. He seemed to size up the situation before sighing. "Wait here." He turned and disappeared down the hall. Minutes passed. The waiting room was uncomfortably silent, except for the occasional whispers from officers behind the desk. Elijah could feel the weight of their stares. Finally, another officer emerged, a sergeant with graying hair. He didn't look pleased. "Come with me." Elijah and Harold followed him into a small, windowless office. The sergeant leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" Elijah met his gaze, his voice steady. "Yes." The sergeant exhaled sharply. "All right, give me names." Elijah's chest tightened. He didn't know their names, but their faces were burned into his memory. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can describe them." The sergeant's expression darkened. "Fine, let's start there." As Elijah recounted the terrifying night, He realized this wasn't just about filing a complaint. It was about proving that no one was above accountability. Elijah described the officers in as much detail as possible: their height, their build, the sneering expressions on their faces. The sergeant scribbled notes, his expression unreadable. When Elijah finished, the room fell silent. "You got any witnesses?" the sergeant finally asked. Elijah shook his head. "No, but Harold found me tied up. He helped me." Harold nodded. "That's right. And I know how this works. You got cameras around that area. Pull the footage." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "I'll see what I can do." Elijah leaned forward. "What happens now?" The sergeant set his notepad down. "An internal review. If we identify the officers, we'll investigate." Harold let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah? And how many of these investigations actually lead to action?" The sergeant didn't flinch. "That's not my call." Elijah clenched his fists. He had expected resistance, but the dismissive tone in the sergeant's voice made his blood boil. "So that's it? I just have to wait and hope something happens?" The sergeant exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Look, kid, I won't lie to you. Complaints like this don't always go far without evidence." Elijah's frustration grew. "So, if there's no footage, they get away with it?" The sergeant didn't answer. Harold stood. "Come on, Elijah. We're not done here." As they walked out of the office, Elijah turned to Harold. "What now?" Harold smirked. "Now, we make sure this story gets heard." Elijah felt a new determination settle in. If the system wouldn't listen, he'd find someone who would. Elijah and Harold stepped out of the police station, frustration weighing heavily on them. The group of supporters was still waiting outside, eager to hear what had happened inside. Harold didn't waste any time. "They're stalling," he announced. "Typical, but we're not going to sit around and hope for justice." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Then what do we do?" A young woman from the group stepped forward. "We take this public." She introduced herself as Maya, a local activist. "We get your story out there, social media, the news, protests if we have to." Elijah hesitated. He had wanted justice, but now it felt like he was about to step into something much bigger. "You think that'll work?" Maya nodded. "They can ignore a complaint. They can't ignore an entire city demanding answers." Harold grinned. "Told you, son, stories got power." By that evening, Elijah's story was spreading like wildfire. Maya helped him write a detailed post about what happened, and within hours, it had thousands of shares. People from all over the city were outraged. Local reporters started calling, asking for interviews. Even a national news outlet reached out. Then came the biggest shock, an anonymous tip. Maya's phone buzzed with a message. She read it, eyes widening. "Someone just sent me something big," she whispered. Elijah leaned in. "What is it?" She turned the phone around. On the screen was a blurry but unmistakable security camera still. 2 officers dragging Elijah toward the electric pole. Proof. Elijah's heart raced. The cops thought they had silenced him. Instead, they had just given him the key to their downfall. Elijah stared at the image on Maya's phone, his breath catching in his throat. There it was, undeniable proof. 2 officers, their faces partially visible, restraining him against the electric pole. Harold let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Maya's fingers flew across her screen. "I'm sending this to every journalist I know." Elijah hesitated. "Won't they try to bury this? Make excuses?" Maya looked him dead in the eye. "They'll try, but this is too big now. They can't control the narrative anymore." Within an hour, the image was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with calls for justice. People were demanding answers, tagging city officials, the mayor, even the police chief. And then the department responded. A cold, formal statement appeared on their social media. "We are aware of the allegations involving 2 of our officers. An internal investigation is underway. We take these matters seriously." Elijah scoffed. "That's it? We take these matters seriously?" Harold smirked. Translation, "We got caught and now we're scrambling." Just then, Maya's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it and her eyes widened. "The police chief just called a press conference. In 30 minutes. Elijah's stomach flipped. "You think they're going to do the right thing?" Harold folded his arms. "They don't have a choice now." Maya grabbed her keys. "Come on. We're not watching this on TV. We're showing up." Elijah took a deep breath. The cops had left him tied up, powerless. But now he had the power, and he wasn't backing down. Elijah, Harold, and Maya pushed through the crowd gathering outside the police department. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens filled the space, their voices blending into a restless buzz. Camera crews set up, waiting for the police chief to speak. Elijah felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. This was no longer just his fight. It belonged to everyone demanding justice. The doors to the station opened, and Police Chief Raymond Holloway stepped out, flanked by officers. His face was stern, his posture rigid. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and cleared his throat. "We are aware of the disturbing images circulating online," Holloway began. "Let me be clear. The conduct shown in that footage does not align with the values of this department." Maya muttered under her breath, "Here comes the damage control." Holloway continued, "Effective immediately, the 2 officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, but others shouted in frustration. "That's not enough," someone yelled. Elijah clenched his fists. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "What about criminal charges?" The chief hesitated, his gaze landing on Elijah. "The matter is under review." "Under review?" Elijah repeated, his voice rising. "They tied me to a pole and left me there like I wasn't human, and you're telling me it's under review?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Holloway exhaled, his grip tightening on the podium. "We will conduct a thorough investigation." Elijah wasn't satisfied, and neither was the crowd. He could see it. The system was trying to control the damage, but they weren't going to let this die down. Harold leaned in and whispered, "This ain't over, son. Not by a long shot." Elijah nodded. If the system wouldn't bring justice, they would demand it. Elijah walked away from the press conference, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. The chief's words meant nothing. Administrative leave wasn't justice. It was a way to protect those officers while the heat died down. Maya was already on her phone. "We need a bigger response, a protest. We can't let them sweep this under the rug." Harold nodded. "You got the city's attention, Elijah. Now you got to keep it." Elijah exhaled sharply. He had never been the type to lead anything, but he realized now he didn't have a choice. "I'll do it," he said. "But we do it the right way. Peaceful. No excuses for them to turn this around on us." Maya smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking." Within hours, social media was flooded with plans for a march to City Hall. The message was clear. They weren't just demanding suspensions, they wanted real consequences. The next morning, Elijah stood at the front of the crowd, a sea of people behind him. Signs waved in the air, "Justice for Elijah," "End police brutality, we won't be silenced." As they marched, their voices rang through the streets. Reporters followed, capturing every moment. Helicopters hovered above. The whole city was watching, but so were the police. Officers lined the sidewalks, some gripping batons, others with hands on their holsters. Elijah's heart pounded, but he kept moving. They reached City Hall, where a podium had been set up. The mayor was waiting. Elijah stepped forward, took a deep breath, and grabbed the microphone. "If they think we're going to let this go," he said, his voice steady, "they don't know us at all." The crowd roared in agreement. This was just the beginning. The energy in the crowd was electric as Elijah stood at the podium, his heart pounding. The mayor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a stiff posture, stepped forward. She adjusted the microphone, her gaze sweeping over the restless sea of people. "I want to start by saying that what happened to Elijah Carter was unacceptable," she began. "No citizen should ever experience such treatment at the hands of those sworn to protect them." A few scattered claps sounded, but most of the crowd remained silent, waiting for her next words. "The city has launched an independent investigation," she continued. "I have personally spoken with the police chief, and I assure you that if wrongdoing is found, appropriate action will be taken." Maya shook her head, whispering to Elijah, "She's saying a lot of nothing." Elijah stepped forward. "With all due respect, Mayor, that's not enough." His voice was clear, unwavering. "We already have proof. What we need is accountability. Now, not after another investigation, drags on for months." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. The mayor's lips tightened, but she nodded. "I hear you, and I understand the frustration. That's why I'm calling for an emergency city council meeting to discuss this incident and our policies regarding police misconduct." Elijah wasn't satisfied. "Will the officers be arrested?" The mayor hesitated. "That decision is up to the district attorney." The crowd booed. Elijah pressed on. Then we demand a meeting with the DA. The mayor sighed. I will arrange it. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. Elijah turned to the crowd. This fight isn't over. We keep pushing until real justice happens. The cheers were deafening. The system was trying to stall, but Elijah wasn't backing down. 2 days after the protest, Elijah, Maya, and Harold found themselves sitting across from District Attorney Robert Langston in a sleek conference room inside City Hall. Langston was a tall, clean-cut man in his late 40s, his expression unreadable as he adjusted his tie and folded his hands on the table. I understand why you're upset, Langston started. This is a serious case, and we're taking it seriously. Elijah clenched his fists. Then why haven't the officers been arrested? If it were me tying someone to a pole, I'd be in jail right now. Langston sighed. There's a process to these things. We need to gather all the facts. Harold scoffed. We already got the facts, the picture, the witness statements. What more do you need? Maya leaned forward. The people want justice, and they're not going to wait forever. Langston tapped a pen against the table, clearly feeling the pressure. Internal Affairs is conducting their own investigation, but my office needs to be sure we have an airtight case before we move forward. Elijah shook his head. This isn't about a case. This is about politics, isn't it? Langston's jaw tightened. I have to consider all angles. Harold let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, including the angle that makes sure you don't step on the wrong toes. A tense silence filled the room. Then, Langston exhaled and leaned back. Look, give me until the end of the week. I'll review the evidence. If it's strong enough, I'll file charges. Elijah narrowed his eyes. And if you don't, Langston met his gaze, then you'll have your answer about where I stand. Elijah nodded. All right, we'll be waiting. As they left City Hall, Maya turned to Elijah. Think he'll do the right thing? Elijah exhaled. We'll see, but if he doesn't, we make sure the whole world knows. The week passed slowly, each day filled with tension. The city was watching, waiting for District Attorney Langston to make his decision. Protests continued outside the police department and City Hall, growing larger by the day. News outlets kept the pressure on, replaying Elijah's story over and over. Then, on Friday morning, the announcement came. Langston stood behind a podium at a hastily called press conference, his expression serious. Cameras flashed as he cleared his throat. After careful review of the evidence, my office has decided to move forward with criminal charges against Officers Bennett and Crowley. The crowd outside erupted into cheers. Elijah, watching from home with Harold and Maya, felt his heart pound in his chest. Langston continued. The charges include unlawful detention, aggravated assault, and official misconduct. They will be placed under arrest and will stand trial for their actions. Harold let out a triumphant laugh. They didn't have a choice. Maya grinned. This is because we didn't back down. But Elijah wasn't celebrating just yet. He knew this was only the beginning. Now we have to make sure they don't walk free. The police union immediately released a statement condemning the charges, calling them politically motivated and an attack on law enforcement. Some officers even staged a protest of their own, standing in solidarity with Bennett and Crowley. Elijah's stomach churned. They're going to fight this every step of the way. Maya nodded. Then we fight harder. The battle wasn't over. The trial was coming, and Elijah knew the system would do everything it could to protect its own. But he wasn't going to let them win. The trial of Officers Bennett and Crowley became the most watched case in the city's history. Every news station covered it, every detail dissected by legal analysts and the public alike. Elijah sat in the front row every day, his presence a reminder that this was not just another case, it was his life. Harold and Maya never left his side. The prosecution presented the evidence. The viral photo, medical reports showing the injuries Elijah suffered, and testimony from witnesses who saw the officers tie him to the electric pole. When Elijah took the stand, his voice was steady. They treated me like an animal, like my life didn't matter. The defense tried to spin the story, arguing the officers had misjudged the situation and were simply trying to contain a potential threat. But no one was buying it. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The verdict. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the jury's decision. On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. On the charge of aggravated assault, guilty. On the charge of official misconduct, guilty. A collective exhale rippled through the room. Elijah closed his eyes, the weight of it all hitting him at once. The officers looked stunned, their privileged shield finally broken. The judge handed down the sentence, 10 years in prison. The crowd outside erupted in celebration. People cheered, hugged, and chanted Elijah's name. But for him, it wasn't about fame. It was about proving that justice could still exist. Later that night, standing in the streets where it all began, Elijah looked at Maya and Harold. "We did it." Maya smiled. "No, you did it. Justice had been served." But Elijah knew this was just one battle in a much bigger fight, and he was ready for whatever came next. If you were moved by Elijah's fight for justice, don't let the message stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep stories like this alive. Your voice matters. Every share spreads awareness. Every comment sparks conversation. Let's stand together against injustice. Like this story? Share it with your friends. Drop a comment below. What did you think of Elijah's journey? Subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change. Together, we make a difference. Let's keep the fight for justice going.